morning. Thank you so much for joining us for daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. I'm Dan. I'm the teaching pastor here at Redeeming Life, and I'm just glad that you've taken the time to join us for daily devotions. And today we're going to continue our series through the Psalms, and we're going to be landing on Psalms 146 and 147. Can you believe that? We're almost at the end of our completion of Psalms 1 through 150. And boy, it's been a marathon. But thank you so much for sticking with us and joining us as we meditate on the Psalms and we open up our ears to hear what God has to say through it. And if you don't know, we follow a reading plan at Redeeming Life Fellowship. It's the Revive School reading plan. It's designed to take you through the Old and New Testaments over the course of 2 years. And so there should be a link in the description below. You'll also find links to our website, our Facebook page, and opportunities that you can support this church plant here in Whitley County. So without further ado, let's jump into Psalms 146 and 147. So, go ahead, if you haven't already, take the time, pause, maybe get a sip of coffee, a bite of toast, and I mean, if you like toast, I don't know, I like toast, and we'll look through Psalm 146 together. So, Psalm 146, by no measure, is the longest, or even among the longer of the Psalms. But there's actually a lot to unpack here. And if you've been following along, I'm sure by now, you've caught a rhythm or a pattern or some themes that are recurring through lots of the different Psalms that happen. They emerge over and over and over again. And this psalm, like many psalms, is a psalm of praise, but you can see at the beginning a theme that's front-loaded at the psalm that we've seen before. And it's in verse 3. The psalm is praise to God, but praise to God for his trustworthiness. And that at the very beginning is this issue about who it is that you and I, as people, as human beings, trust with our very lives, trust for our sustenance, that we trust for our wholeness and well-being and purpose for living, in fact. So we've dealt with this theme of trust through many of the Psalms, and I'm encouraged for that because perhaps you, like me, have known that even when God does something spectacular or amazing or works a miracle in your life or in somebody else's life or my life, that there will always be occasions thereafter where I realize that my ability or capacity to trust God needs growth. It always needs occasion for growth or stretching where I'm learning to what degree or in what sense or in what profound ways I need to learn to trust God. And that God provides occasions or situations, testing points, risk indeed in my life that are designed, they're instrumental in the hands of God to bring about the sort of trusting heart that he desires in my life and in yours. So, troublesome times will come, and we can learn so much from the Psalms in reading them and meditating on them and having its message massage the heart, as it were, and cultivate the kind of trusting intimacy with God in the same way that a child has this trusting intimacy with a loving mother or father. So, but again, that's a lot to unpack in 146, and we've been going over this theme of trust over and over again. So But what I also find interesting is that with verses 3 and 4, doesn't it expose our tendency that when in times of need that we look to persons of power for trust? In this case, princes, royalty, people of power, or immortal men who cannot save. In true synonymous parallelism, even I would say actually synthetic parallelism, the psalmist has a way of aligning two thoughts together to make a single thought. And that is that these royal princes, persons of power who have the power to give things and to take away, that these princes, even for what measure of power they have, does not make them anything more than mortal men who are going to die, who are going to be replaced by somebody else, and that person is going to die. And that the person who occupies this seat of power is not going to last forever. And we can't fully trust our lives and our whole beings, our whole selves to them in the same way that we can trust our lives and our whole beings and our protection to the hands of a living God. What we have in Psalm 146, when it says this, blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God. So that the psalmist is wanting to paint a picture to say, this person who's blessed, our aim, our goal is to want to be like that person. That if this person is in a blessed state and we desire to be in a blessed state, that it's inviting us to look to this God who we can trust and put our hope in him. And what I love about Psalm 146 is that it doesn't just simply say, trust in God, just trust in God, trust in God. It actually expands upon the reason why God is so trustworthy. And there's at least three features that, in a proper sequence about why it is that we can trust God in the way that we can. You can see it unpacked in verses 6, namely in verse 6, the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and everything in it, the Lord who remains faithful forever. Two key features there. One of them being that God is unfathomably powerful. He is indeed the maker of heaven and earth. There is no extent or expanse that you can see in the heavens above or down to the microcosms of the earth below and not behold something that is not created by the hands of this loving God. He's that powerful. And not only is he that powerful, but he's also faithful forever. He is immeasurably faithful, that his faithfulness just does not end. And thanks be to God, because not only is he that powerful, not only is he that faithful, but he is profoundly compassionate. Because isn't it so that when people tend to ascend to positions of power, they have a way of forgetting or disregarding things or peoples or issues who are below. It's the problems are too small, too insignificant for somebody who's that important. This is the way in which that we use the figure of speech when somebody is down to earth. That is, they're not so high or full of themselves that they're they don't concern themselves with the nitty-gritty. Look at how the compassion of God is expressed. He upholds the cause of the oppressed. He gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets the prisoners free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. Are you catching some pictures or allusions to maybe the Sermon on the Mount and the ministry of Jesus here? I hope you are, because this casting of the vision of the hands of God who does these sorts of things are clearly reflected in the Gospels. But that's another point for another day. But yeah, the Lord watches over the alien. He sustains the fatherless and the widow, but he frustrates the way of the wicked. Another way of saying this is that the God who reveals himself in the Bible through his word, he's not a respecter of persons, and he does not look at anyone and say, that's not my problem. He doesn't look at anybody. The fatherless, the poor, the widow, the alien, that's people who are on the outside and estranged from him. He never looks at them and just says, that's not my problem. So for how powerful God is and how faithful God is, to that extent, he is just as compassionate. The last point I think I want to make here is that the way in which God takes care and exercises his loving care for all of creation and all of people, he intends to mediate through people like you and me. That he wants you and myself to become agents of his blessing. Think about the Garden of Eden, where God makes this glorious and beautiful garden. And it's not as though God is incapable of sustaining and caring for a garden. He created the whole thing for goodness sake. Indeed, for goodness sake. But then he creates human beings. He assigns them, gives them work and gives them labor to exercise the care and compassion and the love and the cultivation of this beautiful garden to the hands of people like you and me. So that the love and the care and the power and the compassion and the faithfulness of God is reflected through his people. And this is an encouragement to me to remember that if these people are important enough in God's eyes to be loved and served in this kind of a way, they should be just as important and lovely and worthy of our time and attention in our eyes. This is why, if you ever see me at Aldi, and one of the things that I've tried to work and cultivate in my own life is to reflect God's love towards people who are around me, and I do so because they're worth it. That there is nobody who is not worthy of showing this kind of tenderness and compassion and steadfast love. That's a reflection of the love of God. And these are supposed to be marks of characteristics of God's people. And I'll close with a quote from somebody called Julian the Apostate. Have you ever heard of Julian the Apostate? Well, Julian the Apostate is a very interesting character. Short story, he was a Roman emperor of mid-4th century AD. And this is, to my understanding, post-Constantine, where Constantine took the Roman Empire and sort of Christianized it and made Christianity its official religion. And later on comes Julian, and Julian, his policy is to get the whole empire away from Christian worship and following Christ and going back to the pagan gods. That if he did that, and worshiping the gods of Rome, that the empire, the Roman Empire, would finally be restored to its Roman glory. And he was the one who, or among many others, who referred to the Christians as atheists because they didn't believe in the in the gods of Rome. They regarded them as idols. And yeah, Christian atheists, can you believe that? And but one of the things, we have a quote from Julian the Apostate, who is reflecting on the way in which the character of these Christians differs historically from anybody else that the Roman Empire has ever seen. And he says this: atheism, that's the Christian faith, has been specially advanced through, hear this, loving service rendered to strangers, and through their care for the burial of the dead. So that even once people are dying or are dead, they're still extending compassion to those who have gone. No doubt, this is a theology of resurrection that's tied into Julian's confession, or Julian's observations here. And here, check this out. It is a scandal that there is not a single Jew, who's reading, Psalm 146, who is, it is a scandal that there is not a single Jew who is a beggar, and that the godless Galileans, another word for the Christians, care not for their own people, they care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well, while those who belong to us look in vain for the help that we should render them. So, coming from the words of an apostate, someone who has turned his back upon the God who reveals himself in the Bible, recognizes that these Christians are unlike any other, not only because they care for their own, but they care for those who are on the outside. That they're alive and living in the middle of the 4th century is a picture, a reflection of the compassion and the love of God that transcends these boundaries and doesn't just transcend them, but transforms them. So how about Psalm 146? I told you there was a lot to unpack there, but thank you so much for listening. Let's touch a little bit on Psalm 147. Are you following me? I hope you are. Bree, Beth, Tom, B, I love you guys. Go ahead and pause and read Psalm 147 if you haven't already. Yeah, Psalm 147 is another psalm of praise. And I want you to pause and just think about this for a second. One of the features of the Psalms that gives it diversity, even though there's lots of psalms of praise, the diversity and the playing with different thematic strands throughout the Psalms, you just want to ask the question, it's a psalm of praise, but a psalm of praise for what? Ask yourself the question, what is the psalmist praising God for specifically? Because in some cases it's for his compassion, in some other cases it's for his power, some other cases it's for its love, and not as though that these qualities in God are somehow pitted against each other, but it's the way in which, as we've said before, God has opened his heart to the psalmist, and the psalmist is opening his heart to God and reflecting the light of his glory and his revelation all around him. So, when there's this psalm of praise and he's opening his heart to God, it's like there's a prism of light, a specific prism of light that the psalmist is reflecting. And in this case, ask yourself, what is it that he's reflecting on? What is he opening his heart in love and adoration towards God for? And if I could summarize it in 2 things, it's praise for God's power and his providence. In the same way, just before that we looked at God's power and his faithfulness and his compassion. And indeed, there's some strands that are woven into this about that. And that not only can we see God's power at work, but also his providence because he's intimately involved in the care and the sustaining and the love that he pours out over all of his creation. And for that reason, if this is the kind of God who shows this kind of care towards all of his creation, he is, for that, not only worthy of praise, but also trustworthy above all. Reflect a little bit on verses 16 through 18, where it says, he spreads the snow like wool and scatters the frost like ashes. He hurls down hail like pebbles. Who can withstand his icy blast? Marvelous poetic imagery. And then, who sends his word and melts them. He stirs up his breezes and the waters flow. So, this glorious picture of God who is indeed Lord over the seasons and Lord over time, that the same God who is sending one season is sending the other season in this union of change and permanence and the rhythms of all of life that allows things to pass away in their time and then bring them back to life. That's the kind of power. And I just want you for a moment, compare that image of God's sovereignty over time and creation and rhythms and patterns of life, and compare it to the way in which our government handles an issue like daylight savings time. Now, just think about what sort of a mess and mishandling we've gotten ourselves in when we could allow the government control over 1 hour of time. Can you imagine trusting the government with the changing of the seasons? To my mind, at best, what we would get if we trusted any human government with the changing of the seasons would look something like the way C.S. Lewis described in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a land where it is always winter and never Christmas. Probably is what we would get. But it takes a psalm like this certainly raises my attention to recognize that this is the same God who is in control of the very seasons and feeds and sustains all of creation. If you're reading something like this, you should be hearing echoes of a psalm like this in Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, who says, "Why do you worry about your life? God, who feeds the sparrows, exercises his tender, loving care for these birds. How much more valuable are you than sparrows?" For that, we can trust God with our very lives. And what the crux, I think, it actually falls right about in the middle of the entire psalm. 20 verses. Look at verses 10 and 11, right at the very middle, and ask yourself, of all creation, what is it that God delights in? Let's read it. His pleasure, God's pleasure, is not in the strength of the horse, nor his delight in the legs of men. Those are images of strength and power. Surely, where a powerful God makes things that reflect his power, that's the sort of thing that God would delight in. But that's not what he delights in. The Lord delights in those who fear him, who put their hope in his unfailing love. I think that about says it all. It can be easy to think that the things that please God the most are things that certainly reflect his power. But what God delights in are those who open their hearts and humble themselves to see not only God's power, but also his providence, who recognize God as God and we as his people, who fear the Lord and put their hope in him. That's what God delights in. And so, do you want to be a person that God delights in? That of all of his creation, that he looks at someone like you, in me, and says, I delight in you. Let's be persons who fear the Lord, who recognize his tender, loving care and his providence and his power over all creation. And let us put our hope in him. I want to be a person that God delights in. The only way I can be that kind of person is if I humble myself before the Lord. So, if you haven't today, take time to humble yourself before the Lord. Pray, Lord, I see your work and your majesty and your loving care over all of creation. And I humble myself before you. Lord, teach me how to fear you and to put my hope in you. Let that be our prayer today, so that we can indeed live in abiding relationship with the living God and cultivate this life-giving intimacy with him. So those are Psalms 146 and 147. It's been so great. Thank you so much for joining us for Daily Devotions. If you haven't already, click on or subscribe. Find the link to our reading plan in the description below. And I look forward to the time when we get to meet on Wednesdays and Sundays and unpack scripture at greater length, and not just learn how to read it well and to interpret it well, but also to apply it well. So thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you then, or seeing you next Thursday. So God bless you, God love you, and I'll see you next time.